police and emergency services. Blood everywhere. There's blood everywhere. Is that correct? Of course. Listen to me. Is there blood everywhere? This is conscious and breathing. Oh my God.
This frantic phone call was the catalyst sparking the investigation into one of the more bizarre cases of murder you'll likely ever see, and a crime scene that provided more questions than answers. Hello and welcome back to the Little Shop of Crime, curators and purveyors of all things macabre and mysterious, Antipodean edition. Yes, I am forbidden from doing the accent, but today we take our first trip down under. But first, if you're new around here, I offer both solved and unsolved cases weekly, so if you love true crime, murder, then do that thing. And boy, have I got an odd case for you today. It's not that well known, so I hope it's new to most of you. I don't want to say too much about it because it's a real unraveller. Let's just investigate. This is the bizarre case of Peter Shellard. You bunch of galahs. Today's case takes us to Melbourne, on the southeastern coast of Australia. Located in the state of Victoria, Melbourne is the country's second most populous city, and it's home to over 5 million Melburnians. Noted for its cultural heritage, world-class sports venues and galleries, the city is a melting pot of street art, live music and theatre. And located 7.5 miles southeast of Melbourne's bustling business district is the small, affluent suburb of Caulfield, where 56-year-old self-made multimillionaire Peter Shellard lived alone in his pride and joy, the $6 million, 14-bedroom heritage-listed mansion Rose Craddock. Back in 2005, Peter Shellard was worth over $15 million. Which he made through real estate as well as dealing in Rolls-Royce cars and parts. He was one of your eccentric millionaires, obsessed with money but adored by his friends and family, and known to be a bit of a joker, which we'll get into later. Always up to mischief was Peter. He loved to stick it to the man, and he wasn't shy of breaking rules and taking on the bureaucracy in court as the self-titled public defender. He once even made an appearance on the early 90s Today Tonight TV show, where he outlined his plans to one day buy the entire Rolls-Royce factory, worth about $16 billion. At the time, he said, "Well, I probably am a bit mad, but it's nice to be a bit mad, isn't it?" Peter met with fellow divorcee Shirley Withers in 2001. She had 2 kids of her own, and at 33 years old, she was almost 20 years his junior. He fell madly in love, and so Shirley found herself in a new lifestyle filled with luxury. The pair were inseparable, and whatever Shirley wanted, she got. Peter financed her dream of owning a fashion boutique called Suzette in the upmarket town of Brighton, and in return he made use of her experience as a bookkeeper, putting her in charge of the accounts on his car dealership. Described as mumsy, Shirley wasn't the typical playboy millionaire's glamorous partner, but he was smitten. And according to his friends, Peter had tired of dating women who were only interested in his bank balance, and Shirley was different. Peter's friends knew that Shirley was good for him. His own 3 children saw her as a second mum, and she had a lot of patience. By all accounts, most girls wouldn't have been able to put up with all of Peter's antics. And he was so enamoured with her that he even bought her her own house. Twice divorced, he was in no rush to move in with her, so he stayed in his Caulfield mansion. But naturally they had a key for one another's home, and everything was going well for the loved-up couple. That is until the day that both of their lives would be completely turned upside down. This day started out like any ordinary day. Shirley worked in her boutique all day before locking up, picking up a takeout and heading over to Peter's house, where she spent most nights. She put the food in the kitchen and searched for Peter. That's when she made the grisly discovery. The bludgeoned and beaten body of Peter, her boyfriend of 4 years, in his bedroom. And it was at this point, shortly before 7 p.m, that she made the distressed 000 call.
Emergency services. Blood everywhere. Is that correct? God, listen to me. Is there blood everywhere? This is conscious and breathing. Oh my God. What's your name? Shirley Withers.
Police and forensic pathologists arrived within minutes, and there they found the startling and puzzling crime scene, which they described as looking like something from a movie set. Peter was on the bedroom floor, trussed with dog leashes, electrical cord and rope. He was gagged and handcuffed, wearing nothing but bloodied underwear. There was also a blood-soaked pillow nearby, and his body was surrounded by a bunch of bondage equipment. Masks, whips, chains, you name it. It definitely smacked of a sexual encounter that had gone horribly wrong. Was this the scene of a bondage session that had become a little too rough? Naturally, police began to investigate this angle a little deeper. They asked Shirley about the bondage and she had little info to give them. He had once asked her to participate, but she had declined. She said that he had respected her decision and didn't press it any further, and that she was completely unaware that he was participating in any bondage at all. But it turned out that despite not having pursued his interest in bondage with Shirley, that hadn't stopped him pursuing it elsewhere. Peter's sordid love life began to become a little more public following his death. It turned out he was a regular patron of Melbourne's explicit S&M fetish club Hellfire. At Hellfire you could live out your darkest fantasies, be tied up, whipped, have hot wax poured over you, or do it all to someone else, of course. He loved bondage so much that at the peak of his interest he would go there as much as every other night. And on his 50th birthday, Peter invited colleagues to a private party, and when they arrived, they discovered it was at Hellfire. His dark sense of humour and alternative lifestyle was certainly no well-guarded secret. At one point, he even tried to poach the Hellfire staff so he could start his own S&M club. What a card. But the more the forensics team looked at the crime scene, the more it didn't quite add up. Peter had cuts to his head, bruising, facial injuries, lacerations to his arms, and the ropes they used to tie him up, they weren't tight. They were just loosely and arbitrarily placed in what investigators were now beginning to interpret as an effort to stage the crime scene as a bondage accident. So they started to rule it out, and it quickly became a murder inquiry. Forensic analysis of the crime scene did unearth some vital clues, namely a bloodied fingerprint on the house phone. Was it Shirley's? She had called emergency services after all. Not only that, but they also found a discarded cigarette butt in the kitchen. Peter was not a smoker, and nor was Shirley, so whose was it? And if the crime scene had been staged, who had staged it? Being his significant other and the last person to see Peter alive, Shirley automatically became a person of interest. And so they dug a little deeper into her. Shirley was born in India before migrating to Australia. She was abused at 9 years old, after which she suffered from PTSD. And after giving birth to her first child, she was in and out of hospital for about a year with chronic postnatal depression. She even attempted to take her own life on 2 separate occasions. Given Peter's wealth, a natural line of inquiry was to have a look at his will to see who might benefit from his death. And his will was very clear. The majority of his massive estate had been left to his 3 daughters. But he did leave his ex-wives some money. $1 each. Even in death, Peter was a jokester. And so police discovered that Shirley stood to gain nothing from his death. Zilch. Nada. And so that removed the most likely motive for his murder. And Shirley had even acted as witness for his will. She appeared shocked and heartbroken, and with no other motive, police started to look elsewhere for suspects. And there was no shortage. It turned out Peter was as ruthless in business as he was successful. He was not a violent man, but rather his method of attack was to try to financially cripple people, filing lawsuits on a whim. Police looked through a long list of past business relationships and lawsuits that Peter had filed against others. Stirring the pot and antagonising people was almost a hobby to Peter. He was not short of enemies. He suffered from bipolar disorder, and his behaviour was evidently erratic at times. He was known to start gardening at 3 a.m, and he once even burnt his historic garden to the ground. And when fire engines arrived, he was enraged. He attacked their hose with a chainsaw as they attempted to put out the fire. He did later apologise and pay for the hoses. He hoarded shipping containers, kept chickens, and began to erect barbed wire fences around his property, which neighbours described as looking like a concentration camp. According to his friends, only occasionally was his behaviour normal. Peter, he definitely made a lot of enemies locally. One of his neighbours even took an injunction out on him after he dumped an enormous pile of elephant dung on her lawn.
I've had an injunction taken out against him because he put a load of manure here. And when I opened the door, he screamed something about elephant shit.
Ultimately, Peter was adored by those close to him, but they did also believe that he antagonised people just for his own amusement. Had one of the people he crossed murdered him? Well, disliking a man and wanting to brutally murder him are two entirely different things. And although the Victoria detectives were not short on leads, they failed to find anything significant. And by all accounts, meeting Shirley had largely put an end to his litigation days. A few days later, Peter's autopsy results came back, and they would have a major impact on the investigation. There was blunt force head trauma and a fractured skull. He had bleeding on the brain, so whoever caused the injury definitely wasn't playing. But toxicology reports also found something very unexpected. There was heroin in his system. Peter was not a drug user. In fact, he was known to be vehemently against it. The only drugs he took were to stabilise his bipolar disorder, but the levels found in his system were enough to have contributed to his death, which the coroner ruled as stemming from a combination of the drugs, the trauma, and underlying heart disease. The lab results also came back. The bloody fingerprint and DNA found on the cigarette butt were not matched to Peter or Shirley. They were conclusively matched to 31-year-old Sophia Stupas. She and her 42-year-old boyfriend Stan Kalinikos were known to police as petty criminals and drug addicts. She had been at the crime scene, and wherever Sophia went, Stanley was never too far away. But despite their long rap sheet, they were not known for violence. Their crimes never went beyond possession and the occasional theft, usually to support their heroin habit. Stan was seen by police as a bit of a gentle giant, and Sophia had never spent any time behind bars. She did have a history in bondage though. Police had found S&M equipment during a raid of her house in an unrelated incident. Given her weak criminal history and small stature, police concluded that she could not have acted alone. And so with her presence helping to explain the crime scene's bondage and heroin elements, both Sophia and Stanley quickly became prime suspects. But what struck police as unusual here is that most burglars will not stand and fight. They tend to flee when they're discovered. But in this case, Sophia and Stan had stayed, fought, and tied Peter up. Why? Maybe they preempted having to force Peter to tell them where his safe or money was stashed. Was this a case of extortion gone wrong? Heroin was their preferred drug, but why inject Peter with it? None of this made sense, and they wanted to find out. But as police began to make their moves to arrest the pair, the investigation hit an unexpected and shocking twist. Police intercepted a phone call that would have massive repercussions for the investigation. A contract had been put out for the lives of Sophia and Stanley. But it wasn't fellow criminals who wanted them dead. The hit was put out by Shirley Withers. This raised questions. How did Shirley Withers know that Stanley and Sophia were involved in Peter's death? That's where Victor comes in. Police had caught wind that Shirley was looking to hire a hitman, and so cue Victor, the undercover cop / gun for hire. He offered to do the job for $10,000. Shirley gave him Stan and Sophia's information as well as a cash deposit, and when Victor asked if she wanted them to be put in hospital, she replied, "Nah, want them dead. They're the ones who killed my Peter, and they have to pay for what they've done. I want blood." Victor asked if she wanted them to suffer, and she simply replied, "Yep." They quickly made a move on Sophia and Stanley. They were arrested and questioned.
Can you provide me with any information on his death? No. You can't? Nothing at all?
They initially denied any knowledge, but that soon changed when they learned that Shirley had put a hit out on them. They sang like canaries. They admitted they were there and knew what had happened. They said they didn't act alone, and in fact there was a third person there that night.
Yeah, Shirley Withers. Shirley.
Following this revelation, police began to poke around Shirley's fashion boutique. On the surface it looked like it was thriving, but as they dug into the accounts they discovered it was losing money fast. It was actually in significant debt, owing roughly $300,000, and Shirley's own personal account was $43,000 in the red. It looked like Shirley had been ordering high-end stock without having sold the stock she had. It was clear that Shirley had no idea how to run a business, but that didn't worry her one bit. She had Peter's vast bank account to steal from. It came to light that Shirley had been stealing from Peter to keep her life of luxury afloat. Investigators discovered that over the course of 12 months she'd written 195 cheques to cash, totalling over $900,000, and it turned out that Peter had already discovered this. He had called his solicitor and accountant who confirmed it, and so they began to collect evidence to have Shirley charged with the theft. Peter was furious and heartbroken. He cancelled her as signatory and immediately stopped funding the boutique. Her life of luxury was over. Not only that, but he'd put Shirley's East Bentley home on the market in order to recoup some of the losses. And just a week before he was killed, he phoned his ex-wife Liz and asked if he should fear Shirley following the revelations. According to her, he did seem scared, and he was right to be, because that's when Shirley allegedly began to hatch her plan. During their interviews, Sophia and Stanley confessed everything. They made it clear that Shirley had masterminded the entire plan and that she was going to let them take the rap for Peter's murder. Shirley had befriended them and begun to formulate her devious plot. She groomed the pair by giving them cash to fund their drug habit, whilst telling them that Peter was abusive, suggesting he tied her up and forced her into bondage, and that he was trying to sell her house from underneath her. They felt indebted due to the supply of drugs Shirley had provided, and so they decided to help. Both Sophia and Stanley told investigators that the plan for them was only ever going to be to rough him up a bit and force him to sign Shirley's house over to her. On the evening of May 6th, Shirley picked up Stan and Sophia, and they drove over to Peter's mansion where they found him asleep in his bed. Sophia and Stanley both jumped on him to begin the attack. In the struggle, Peter managed to bite Sophia's finger, which is what led to the bloody fingerprint. In response, she hit him with a nearby blunt object. It's not clear what that was. At this point, Peter was not dead, and so they dragged him onto the floor and tied him up. It was then that Shirley injected him with the heroin. Sophia told investigators that she solely went there with the intention of tying him up, but Shirley had other plans.
Yeah, that she pretty much wanted to just finish him off.
Sorry?
She wanted to finish him off, I suppose.
Finish you off.
Her husband.
Apparently his moaning quickly subsided following the hot shot of heroin, and the three left his home soon after. Peter had not signed anything, but Sophia had left a signature of her own behind, and Shirley returned the following day to give Peter another shot of heroin, just to make doubly sure he wasn't still breathing. And then she staged the crime scene as a bondage accident gone wrong, and she went to work like it was any normal day, in an attempt to establish an alibi.
I put it to you that you were in fact involved in the planning and execution of a plan that resulted in Peter Shellard's death. What do you say to that?
I have no comment to make.
Shirley gave a no-comment interview, but police had by this point established a financial motive, and so it was the word of two petty criminals versus an upmarket boutique operator. Shirley continued to maintain her innocence, but police looking at Peter's computer hard drive found something that would devastate her defence. 2 wills, one of which named Shirley as the sole beneficiary of his entire estate. Shirley argued that the will was created the previous year, but forensic analysis proved that it had in fact been typed up just days before his death. But even as the evidence continued to mount, investigators wanted the smoking gun. Cue Victor, the undercover hitman detective. And 2.5 weeks after the murder, they struck gold. This was when Victor made his call to Shirley, informing her that he had heard she had a problem that needed fixing, and Shirley agreed to meet. In his final meeting with Shirley, Victor told her that he had done the job, i.e. killed Stan and Sophia. Relieved, Shirley began to spill the beans, admitting to him that she was there on the night he was killed. She also admitted that she had helped to restrain Peter during the fatal assault. and at this point investigators were confident that they had enough to charge the 3 offenders. So Shirley had attempted to hire a hitman to kill Stan and Sophia so that they wouldn't implicate her in the murder. But the irony is that they didn't start talking until Shirley put the hit out on them. But how had Shirley become involved with 2 drug addicts in the first place? Well, it turns out that they had actually been supplying her with amphetamine and heroin. She had a drug habit that she managed to keep secret from everyone. And so on Thursday the 9th of June 2005, all 3 were arrested. During the trial, both Sophia and Stanley pled guilty to manslaughter. They each got 6 years with a minimum of 3.5 years before they would be eligible for parole. Shirley pled guilty to attempting to hire a hitman to kill Stan and Sophia, but she pled not guilty to the murder of Peter. The trial lasted 6 weeks and Shirley was found guilty of murder, and she was subsequently sentenced to 26 years in prison with a minimum of 18 years. Shirley Withers went on to appeal on the basis that she had never intended to kill Peter. Amazingly, despite the brutal, premeditated nature of the attack and the discovery of the falsified will, the Supreme Court agreed with her and her conviction was downgraded to manslaughter. The judge who presided over the appeal was quoted as saying, "The evidence fell short, in our view, of establishing an intention to kill or cause serious injury." Shirley was subsequently sentenced to 13 years, and she has since been released. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate you and your time and your eyeballs. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a quick thumbs up. And it was a weird case, so I can't wait to hear your thoughts in the comments. I'll be back next week with another macabre or mysterious case. But for now, don't be a stranger. Goodbye.